Good morning. Welcome to Member Focus Monday. I'm Christina Schaefer, Social Media Manager for HAR. I will be joined this morning a little bit later by Texas State Senator Paul Bettencourt. This is not him. They are, of course, in traffic. You know how Houston traffic can be, so they should be here in just a matter of moments. But until he arrives, I am joined by my podcast partner in crime, David Mendel. David, welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here. I'm warming the seat for Senator Bettencourt.
Yes, please keep it nice and warm for him.
I'll do my best.
So David, if you don't know, he is our public relations manager, and he did fill in for me a couple months ago when I was out sick on Member Focus Monday.
That's
so
right.
You might look familiar to a few of you. But as our public relations manager, a big part of his role is promoting different things we have here at HAR, as well as putting out the market update. So the market update's coming soon, correct?
Correct. It'll be out next Wednesday. It's always the second Wednesday of the month. And usually I get the data, a couple of days prior, so I have a chance to sort through it and digest it. And I've got to say, so far, I haven't gotten those numbers yet. These will be the July numbers.
Sure.
But the market has been performing extremely well of late, and so no real reason to complain. We've seen a steady increase in the supply of homes, inventory. And pricing, while it's increasing, has only increased very slightly. So we are not worried about anything dramatic, really.
That's great. So next Wednesday, we should expect that full
Correct.
report.
And for people who may not know this, and you and I have talked about this on the podcast, we don't like to have the members or the media wait a whole 4 weeks between reports.
Sure.
So the first business day of every month, we produce something called the Fresh Report. It's the first real estate snapshot of Houston. And that's just a quick, think of it as like an infographic. It's just a one sheet with a look at average sales price, a chance to see what's happening with active listings, and just kind of gauge the market, some key indicators. And that way people aren't waiting. It's more of a 2-week cycle. So we put that out at the beginning of the month, and then 2 weeks later, boom, you've got the full comprehensive report.
That's great. So we just shared that actually last Thursday. So if you missed that, go check that. It's across all of our social media platforms.
Correct. And I have you to thank for helping get the word out about that.
Absolutely. So I did mention that David and I are podcast co-hosts. Do you want to tell our audience about the podcast?
Oh, absolutely. Well, first of all, it's available wherever wherever you get your podcast. But that's our famous tagline. We have new content coming out every Wednesday. And it's for the most part, what we do is we have a chance to kind of analyze and really discuss in greater detail what is covered in your Member Focus Monday updates. And but occasionally we'll generate standalone content, something new where you and I will talk about a pressing issue.
Sure.
Or
this past week.
Exactly. Ask us anything.
Ask us anything, absolutely.
Or sometimes we'll bring a guest in and just do kind of an offline interview. It just really depends on schedules and that sort of thing. But it's an opportunity to really drill down into real estate topics that our members are interested in.
Absolutely.
And we've had great response to it.
Yeah, and it's HAR on the move. If you haven't subscribed yet, you can subscribe, like David said, wherever podcasts are available. There's a big deadline today.
Absolutely. 5 o'clock this evening is the deadline to cast your vote in the 2020, that just sounds so futuristic,
I know,
the 2020 HAR Board of Directors election. If you haven't already voted for your candidates, I should say, please do so sooner than later.
Yes.
And now I will yield the floor to the esteemed Senator Bettencourt.
They're here.
Thanks.
Senator, a pleasure.
No, good morning.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for
Good
being
morning,
here.
Christina. How are you?
Good morning. Good. So I'll let you get settled in there.
Well, no problem. I'm here.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for joining us. I know Houston traffic can be a mess, but we're so glad that you could be here. So I wanted to get right into it. We have you here to talk about the session that we just finished. And of course, we're representing the Realtor Party, so we have a lot of Realtor issues that you are very well aware of. So just to get us started, this legislative session we heard that was very successful. Can you tell us why it was so successful?
Well, it was successful because we actually did real things for real people. In this particular case, we've got real property tax relief. For the first time in 38 years, we're going to see some significant property tax relief. And then on top of that, we did education reform. the end result will mean, Christina, that just this year on property tax bills, people will see a 7 penny reduction in their property tax rates on their school maintenance and operation rate. So that means as values go up, finally, tax rates are coming down. And I know something that the Realtor party had been interested in. I was kind of interested with that way you described it, because the Realtors have been talking about this issue forever, primarily because their customers have been talking about it.
Right.
Because as values have gone up, tax rates have never gone down. So if your values went up 10% a year, then your tax bill went up 10% a year.
Right. So we seems like every couple of years there's tax reform. Can you explain to us just why is there a need to reform so often?
Well, if there's been major reform, I missed it until this last session, okay?
Yes. But
Because
it just seems like we hear that a lot, right?
well, there've been a lot of talk about it. See, the device we used was something called the rollback rate. It was the rate that the maximum allowed increase in last year's tax levy. Now, that had gone up from 5% in 1978 to 8% in 1982, and it stayed there for 38 years. I'm not making this up. So we haven't had any reform on how fast government can grow. Because see, government's growth is what was driving the tax bills. And when you have a limit that high, effectively government was growing at 12, 13, 14% a year, which means that your tax bills could grow close to that. So the good news is that number has come way down. The schools are actually going to have a hard cap on it, because we're going to try to catch up with Robin Hood too. Because that's as the state, as values went up, the state was actually paying less in their budget for schools. So we're actually doing two things at one time, which means I don't think anyone in the United States, any legislature, has tried doing it both at the same time that we're aware of. But that's why it makes it such big property tax reform and school education reform.
Absolutely. So we have 39,000 Realtor members representing people buying and selling homes all around Houston and surrounding areas. In regards to a consumer purchasing a home, what do they need to know about property tax?
Well, you're the professional, Christina. All right. So, I mean, the first thing is they always ask how much they have to pay, and then the second thing they ask is how much are the taxes going to be. Now, what they'll be able to know is that taxes, we hope, will grow about half as fast as they were in the previous 5 years, and that's important, because you could buy a home and you could be happy with what you buy, except that your tax bill takes off on you, and then that puts your budget at risk. So the key thing is that we did it for the Texans that have been, the Texans that are homeowners, and the Texans that will be homeowners, especially millennials, because I'll give you an example. My home that is in West Memorial, I had a starter home just about a mile away. I drove by the day of the debate that we were passing the bill, and I realized that home had gone up 3 times in value in 20 years. So you won't see that 3 times growth in property tax bills anymore, because for us, a family 20 years ago could afford that home, but now a starter home can be $450,000 depending upon where you are. But the good news is that tax bills are not going to go up, and we think this will save somewhere between $750 or $1,000 on tax bills over just the next 5 years for an average home, which is about $200,000. So on that $450,000 home, it could save somewhere close to $3,000.
Okay. So what should consumers know, kind of in regards to that, about how rates are set, the tax rates?
Well, this is a big change too, because while everybody knows, there's one thing everyone knows in life, it's how much did I pay for my first home. They may not remember how much they pay for their car, but they're going to remember how much they pay for their first home. So when they get that first payment in, they'll know that value is they're going to be their baseline. And then what will happen is that the values will go up, but tax rates will come down from there. So what I expect to see is more concentration on actual tax rate setting discussions in the fall. We've actually broken it up, and you'll have the value information where you do your protests, et cetera. And then you'll have, which is happening now, which are value protests all across the area.
Right.
And then there'll be actually a portal that you'll be able to see what's happening on the tax rate setting. Because all too often we saw in these hearings that the response from elected officials was, I'm not raising your taxes because I'm not raising your tax rate. Well, that wasn't true. So now there's nowhere to hide on that discussion.
Okay, very good. So if you're watching and you do have a question for Senator Bettencourt, go ahead and type it into the comments, and we will get to those questions in just a little bit. So kind of switching gears a little bit, what can cities and counties do to reduce costs but still provide ample services?
Well, you know, Christine, that's a great question. It's called priorities. Every one of your customers, all 39,000 Realtors customers, they have to set priorities on their home budget all the time. And that's really what we're talking about having government do. The fact that we're lowering the rollback rates from 8% to 3.5% means that they need to take positions on what's important. What do they spend their money on? Now, here's another key thing. If they need more money, they go to the voters in November and they ask for what would be a voter-approved rate now, which means that there'll be some expenditure the government wants, but the key thing will be voters will get a chance to vote on it. And I think that's a much better situation, because right now, if you've got all the money in the world coming through the system into government coffers and there's no prioritization, then that's why there hadn't been any tax rate relief or any property tax relief. So the key thing is they'll get a chance to vote in November, just like they would on a bond issue. Okay. And I think between being able to protest their value, and right now is a good time for people to be looking at whether they should be appealing or arbitrating or those values. You know that because the Realtors provide a lot of support for that effort.
Absolutely.
And then watching the new tax rate setting policy, I think this will be what we need to start really slowing down property tax bills and, quite frankly, getting government to set priorities. On the school side, we're going to be basically reducing how much money comes from local property taxes to 2.5%. But the state is going to make up with more money. Okay. So the state's actually going to catch up on what was called Robin Hood, which it was even affecting HISD, which is as values went up, they would have to start making payments to schools that needed additional help. And there will be a major change in the HISD board if you want to get into that. I believe there's going to be a board of governors appointed shortly to take over the Houston Independent School District as well, due to lack of economic progress and also an investigation. But with all of this, there's a real chance, I think, to have lower tax bills, better priorities, and also too with the state making up money on schools, then we'll have good educational improvement as well.
That's great. That's great to hear. I'm going to take a second just to see what questions we may have already had come in.
I do live radio, so I can do this.
Yeah, there we go. So you kind of just got into this. Let's just see what Kathy said here. What's being done about better training for protest board members, ARB, regarding following our laws? Currently, there's no accountability, therefore it becomes a game to the detriment of the residents.
Kathy, great question. Okay, we put in appraisal reforms too. First off, we double the amount of ARB training. There actually will be manuals that will be followed, best practices manuals, because as Kathy knows, you can go from one appraisal district to the next and get a completely different result. In fact, some of the commercial apartments, multifamily apartments,
Sure.
There's actually a county not too far from here, they just refuse to do an income method at all. So they'll have to follow top-down instructions. And here's one thing that I think is really good. How many times have people been in front of the appraisal review board where the appraiser said, I really could have had a higher value, but I gave you this value.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's now verboten. They can't say that anymore. Okay. They can't raise your value at a hearing because that was causing homeowners a lot of distress because they would walk in and the person on the other said, well, it's really supposed to be 50,000 higher. Very difficult for a non-professional to argue with.
Absolutely.
So that practice is banned.
Yeah, well, that's great. That's great to hear. I want to talk a little bit about Recapture. Can you explain what that is and what's being due to basically fix that post-session?
Well, we talked a little bit about it
Sure.
Before, but Recapture is effectively when values are basically coming up so rapidly that it triggers part of the school equalization funding formulas. Now, 14 years ago, okay, in about 2004, the total amount of money recaptured from school districts was $1 billion. Just last year, it was $2 billion. And 4 years from now, or 5 years from then, it was going to be $5 billion. What was happening is the values in the formulas were taking an exponential turn. And so that meant $5 billion of money was going to be recaptured and effectively redistributed. That wasn't going to be survivable by any method that I understood, either financially or politically. So we put a lot more money in the system, so the recapture payments are way down. So that means schools will keep more of their local money, and then we're going to limit how much the money can come up, which will further keep recapture from being a problem, and the state's going to spend more money at the same time. So that's really a win-win scenario. But recapture was on the cusp of being not just, it was $1 billion problem, then it became a $2 billion problem. It was going to be a $5 billion problem, and that's real money no matter what government entity we're talking about.
Very good. So we wanted to cover, like I said, some of these realtor issues for the realtor party.
The realtor issues. I love this realtor party stuff. I thought,
yeah, we're very proud.
Well, what a moniker.
But these
that's right.
These are just a few of the topics. Texas Realtors put out this recap of the 86th Texas legislature on their website. You can see it, texasrealestate.com. A lot of different issues, of course, state and tax. Or tax reform, schools, but even things like the TREC sunset review and different things like that. So issues with flooding, seller's disclosure. So be sure to check that out on their website.
I think we passed a bunch of those bills.
Yes, we did.
Yes. And they were the ones you wanted.
Yes.
I remember.
Yes.
Because they were the common sense ones. Like, you know what? You shouldn't be buying something in a flood pool without knowing that you're in a flood pool.
Yeah.
I mean, this is just common sense.
It's common sense stuff. Yes. So again, we're very proud realtor party. Right?
Thank you.
All right. Let's take a look to see what else we have here.
And another question.
Yes. From where will the state get the additional amount to substitute and cut the school funding? What other areas are being compromised for this?
Well, remember, we're not cutting school funding.
Right.
What we're doing is we're cutting how much local tax revenue is going into schools. And we're making that money up with the fact that we've had substantial sales tax collections and, in addition, severance tax collections, because the Permian Basin has changed completely. It's not just the fact that the price has been relatively stable in the $50 per barrel. It's just that the volume is way up and going up to the point where the Permian Basin is one of the big production locations in the world now, just not in the United States.
Kathy actually had a follow-up about the protest process.
Well, let's see if she's 2 for 2.
Okay. She said that can the practice of the appraisers networking privately with ARB members be banned?
Well, that already is the law.
Okay.
Now, there will be a way to file complaints then on ARB members that are doing that type of work. And in addition, we made it easier for them to be dismissed. One of the things we found out was when we went on the hearings, and Lieutenant Governor Patrick had put me in charge of a property tax committee. I had some great senators, bipartisan. We went all around the state. We found out that people that were the head of the appraisal review boards, they simply weren't dismissing ARB members that were not following the law. They just didn't have a real good mechanism for it. I want to also say that all these bills passed with bipartisan support, and that's important because this is an everybody pays issue. I don't care where you live, what you look like, where you sleep, you're paying taxes, and that was why we had two senators from South Texas that happen to be Democrats join the 19 Republicans on these bills, because the pressure on taxation was so strong. In fact, my joke was this, Christina, that the state bird of Texas is no longer just the mockingbird, it's the construction crane. Because those construction cranes are everywhere,
Yeah.
and where you see those, values are coming up like rocket ships, and people were being gentrified out of their homes in a lot of the urban areas too.
Right. All right. So Laney's asking, what if Texas requires buyers to disclose sales price and set tax values accordingly, and that value was set for duration of the of the owner's homestead?
Well, there's a tax on transferring homes has been prohibited by law, and Texas is the largest state in the union that doesn't have sales disclosure. I don't think. I think the legislature agrees with the Realty Party right now that that's something that's a law that we don't want to change. Most appraisal districts get a tremendous amount of information about sales that they purchase, which is enough to make sure that the values are within 5% on residential. And in fact, that's what's happening this year in Harris County and many of the surrounding counties. There's a state ratio study underway to make sure that the values are close to what's being sold. So I think at this point in time that's one law that we don't need to change.
Okay, very good. I saw another question from Robert. Are there any expected laws or bills designed to focus on renewable energy?
There's a big debate about renewables from the standpoint of how much subsidy should they have. Now, we have extended what are 312 and 313 agreements for basically businesses moving in to get tax credits on it. The question will be in the future, should you do tax credits on top of the renewal credits that you have? That's something that I think is up to debate in the next legislative session. And actually most people don't realize it, but it sounds like he does, that Texas is actually the biggest renewable wind producer in the entire United States. So these are important tax questions, but they haven't been resolved yet.
Okay, very good. Okay, so if you have any other questions for Senator Bettencourt, type them in and we'll get to them in just a minute. I wanted to ask you a little bit about the Galveston Bay Park Plan. What's the state's role in that?
Well, if you're looking at the overall discussion of Ike, what was an Ike to Ike, et cetera.
Right.
We've already passed a bill that basically, that Senator Taylor did, that basically has a structure for a maintenance district depending upon what type of actual barrier do we end up with. It looks like the federal government has already put some money in for barriers on the Orange County side. Most people don't realize that Orange itself is an inland port, and that they're looking at using the existing seawall and then going down to terminate around the Corpus area, or maybe it's the Freeport area, depending upon who's talking about it. But this is an important thing. My grandparents survived the 1900 storm, one by swimming through the wreckage wall with their family when their house decayed around them. They later found the house because they had a parrot named Polly in the attic. I'm not making this up. It's actually on the strand where the kids do they've got a tape of my grandmother, her name was Rowan, talking about finding Polly the parrot. My grandfather, they were already on the second floor of the strand, so when the water came up the second floor, they survived. So I've been very interested in this. So we're going to continue to have a coastal spine discussion and barrier discussion, because just 10 years ago, when we almost got hit by Ike, when Ike could have gone instead of over on the Chambers County side, which mostly killed a lot of cattle and unfortunately loss of life was low. It could have gone up the western side of the bay. And at the time, the chief appraiser and I, Jim Robinson, as tax assessor, we figured that it would be 80 billion in damage. It would be now well over 160 billion in damage and a tremendous loss of life if we had a Category 5, not counting how long the ship channel would be knocked out, and especially given the incredible importance of the refining and petrochem industry here. So this is a personal issue that I followed my entire life, and I know Senator Taylor has, and there's a lot of support to continuing to work on those issues. And we also passed a suite of bills that Senator Colcor, Senator Creighton from Montgomery County, and also Senator Perry, who's the chair. They passed a bunch of bills about Harvey expenditures, about catching up with Harvey work, dam construction. So we have money also for the next disaster. There's quite a bit done in this last session, but we'll have to wait for the final Corps of Engineers reports on the dams and also on the actual construction to know exactly how it's all going to look like. But if after I woke up, and I think everyone else has had this experience, when you wake up to the sound of helicopters and airboats in West Memorial, you know it's time to make sure you do something. And we did a lot this session, and we'll continue to do it in future sessions.
Very good. And of course, as I'm sure you know, we've been very adamant in trying to get the word out about flood insurance. You know, the NFIP, we've been big.
Right. I mean, look, folks, if you buy flood insurance, look, the best day of one, well, it wasn't the best day of my life, but it could have been a terrible day for me, was when I had to turn the power off on my West Memorial home because the water got within six inches, okay, because of back flooding. But my wife had bought flood insurance even though we were above a 500-year floodplain. So I hit the breaker and I left, realizing that, well, whatever happened, happened. But the good news is I had insurance for it. So when your realtor tells you to do it, do it.
Get the flood insurance, yes.
Right.
We actually had FEMA on a few months back, and he was giving some of the statistics about the amount of homeowners that have flood insurance, and it was shocking how low they were.
No, and especially, you know, it's one thing to be in what was the 500-year floodplain, but in the 100-year floodplain, or much less than a floodway, look, it's extremely cheap subsidized federal insurance. If you have any question, you should do it.
Very good.
And you know, and we, by the way, we also have disaster reappraisal now. That's a bill that it'll be Proposition 3. I want everyone to vote for Prop 3 in the November ballot, because instead of having to wait for taxing units to pick whether or not they're going to do disaster reappraisal up to when the tax rates are set, it's going to be automatic. And then the appraisal district will give you either a 15 to 100% reduction on your structure. After that, there will be a decision by the commissioner's courts. But after what we've been through, I can't imagine people not triggering disaster reappraisal. And I want to thank Fort Bend County, Montgomery County, Spring Branch, and Katy, and Humboldt school districts for doing the right thing. The county of Harris didn't, the city of Houston and HISD didn't, but hopefully this will have changed that discussion forever, because nothing makes people madder, Christina, than being flooded out of their home and paying 100% on their property taxes. I mean, people were furious about that. So vote for Prop 3 in November.
Very important. Okay. That looks like all we have.
But there's got to be another question. Just one more.
Somebody, David actually made a comment. It's not really a question, it's more of a comment. Do I live in a flood zone? Doesn't matter, buy flood insurance.
Yeah, well, that may be the best way to play Houston, no matter which way you play it. All right.
Right.
So, David, there's a lot of wisdom there. He might have been an Aggie. Who knows?
Debbie asked a question about plumbing commission. What's going on with plumbers? Are they revisiting and doing away with plumbing commission?
To make a long story short, they were in sunset. The bills actually didn't pass, but then Governor Abbott decided that he would actually release a new executive order, which may or may not be challenged, but the plumbing commission's still there, so there's no changes in that at this point.
Very good. All right, so that really looks like it's it from our members. Did you have anything you want to add? Any message you want to get out there to them?
Well, the message is First off, you're responsible really for the vast majority of people of owning their first home, their second or their third homes. It's really important that you keep track of what's happening on taxes. And I really appreciate the tremendous support that we had to pass these bills. I don't think we could have passed them without Realtors' support. And so just stay tuned, because we may have to tune them up. But the good news is that property tax relief's on the way. The Realtors made a big difference. And the good news is that your customers are going to have more money in their pocket, which means they'll be able to buy more too, which is a good thing. I consider that a rising tide that lifts all boats.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us this morning. This has been really informative and helpful. We really appreciate it.
Well, thanks, Christina.
Absolutely. So that's it for this Member Focus Monday. We'll see you back next week at 9 a.m. We have another very special guest planned, so we'll be announcing that later this week. Have a great week, everybody.